Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be talking about the two Hydra DPS and pitting them against each other to see which is better, going over their accessibility, flexibility, and how they fare in certain types of content. Also, quick disclaimer, I am not Nostradamus. Mualani is not out yet, but her kit has been finalized, but even then there is a lack of on-hand playtesting we don't have for her. So with that in mind, there's a high chance that I may get some things wrong. This video is mostly to open the discussion about where these two units will be best in, as well as shed light on Mualani's place in the meta. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. And with that, let's begin. In the right corner, we have the current best DPS in the game, Neuvillette, the Hydro Sovereign. I think his reputation precedes him. He's a HP scaling Hydra DPS that focuses on generating balls so he can consume them. And he uses these balls for his powerful charge attacks. His gameplay loop is very simple. And in the left corner, we have a new challenger, the Natlan tour guide, Mualani. Just because she's new, I'm going to be going over her kit very briefly, but if you want a more in-depth look, go watch my 2 other videos about her. But she's also a Hydra HP scaling DPS, and in her skill she will ride a shark, which will convert her normal attacks into a shark bite. This shark bite gets stronger each time you make contact with an enemy, and when you make contact with an enemy 3 times, her shark bite will be fully stacked and unleash an extra powerful bite. She can do 3 of these strong bites and an extra smaller one within her damage window. So her gameplay loop is make contact with an enemy 3 times, unleash a bite, repeat, sneak in an extra hit, and then unleash her burst before or after this damage window. Due to how slow she attacks, this actually means that she's the first Hydro carry that wants you to run her as a vaporized DPS. So most of our best teams are going to be vape teams, so you can double down on these strong hits. And with our fighters introduced, let's decide who's better. The first category I want to talk about is accessibility. Pretty much how easy are these units to gear and play. Since they are both HP scaling Hydro characters, their weapon options are pretty much the same with some minor differences. For Neuvillette, he has 3 weapon options, being Sacrificial Jade, Prototype Amber, and his signature, as every other weapon is just worse than Prototype Amber, which is a free craftable. And with Mualani, it's the same deal, but instead of Prototype Amber, she has the new Natlan craftable, which has the same stats as Amber but gives a normal attack damage bonus, which is not something Neuvillette, the charge attack damage dealer, can really benefit from. So the weapon is pretty much equal to Amber for him. And due to this, from my calculations, at a free-to-play level, Mualani should theoretically do more personal damage than Neuvillette within their damage windows, but I'll explain in a bit why that isn't everything. Then extending to other options, most people aren't really running Neuvillette in vape teams where he benefits from the EM, so when you refine Sacrificial Jade, it benefits Mualani a lot more as she's run on vape teams. Though when it's a low refined Sacrificial Jade, it matters less as it gives less EM. Also, a funny issue with Sacrificial Jade on Mualani is that it's literally impossible to not overcap crit rate due to the 40% she gets from her artifact set and the 24% from Ascension. This means you're going to have some of the stupidest ratios, but just because of the amount of stats you get from the weapon, it's still going to be worth it. And for signature weapons, both are obviously good but aren't an enormous upgrade from Sacrificial Jade R5. In Mualani's case, her burst isn't buffed by her weapon, which is a massive advantage Sacrificial Jade has, as her burst hits harder than my dad when I was a child, which I find funny. The Mualani weapon part, not the beating. But to summarize, weapons wise, Mualani has choices that are just closer to her signature more than Neuvillette does, who has to run Prototype Amber at a free to play level. And if you have Jade and end up refining it, Mualani also scales better with it than Neuvillette, so her weapon options overall are more synergistic with her. Though there is the other part of accessibility, which is how easy the characters are to play, which I don't think I really need to go on about, but sure. Mualani's gameplay loop is around 10 seconds of her having to surf near an enemy to attack 4 times, then unleash her burst before or after this damage window, meaning she has to stay glued to the enemies. She does actually play somewhat similarly to Linny, but less cringe as you can move around and don't have to aim. Her quality of life downsides are that you most likely are going to want extra interruption resistance, preferably by Zude or Zhongli, but this isn't a massive downside as they're some of her best teammates regardless. And if you use them, most of her stagger issues just disappear. Next, you need to collide with enemies in order to build up stacks, and the most optimal scenarios for this are in AoE where multiple enemies are close, or bosses that don't move around much. This is going to be an issue on mobile bosses like Kenki that can just teleport, since her damage ranges are quite unforgiving, and unlike Neuvillette or Arlecchino, you can't just swap off to her to do things like reapply buffs or reposition. Also, because you want as few Hydra applications as possible on her vape teams, applying buffs like VV can be quite awkward, and even if you do, depending on her rotation, it potentially isn't lasting that long either, making her better with characters that have much longer buff up time. From what I know, her stack generation is also ping dependent, so if you're a higher ping player, you may not be able to perform her 4-hit combos as consistently, so those are all things to keep in mind. Her quality of life upsides are that she's going to be extremely extremely brain dead to play, as you just need to press the normal attack button 4 times and use her ultimate and you'll get some of the highest screenshot damage in the game. There are no real hard combos or cancel techs to learn for her besides trying to get the 4th hit, which is dependent on the content type more than anything, so she's not mechanically demanding at all. Another positive is that she can mark multiple enemies and each marked enemy will take the same amount of damage, up to 5 enemies, so as long as enemies are relatively close you can realistically play her without a grouper at all. Similar to the way that Nahida just marks enemies and then when you proc her mark all enemies linked take damage. That is very nice for AoE content. But this all pales in comparison to Neuvillette, you've heard it all. Flexible damage windows, effectively infinite range in AoE, self-healing, can outspace enemies and attack from a distance, and there are only a few downsides I can think of I guess, like sometimes you can absorb his newer balls instead of his older ones, which can be annoying, but besides that he's close to the comfiest unit in the game to pilot and is equally as brain dead to play. So, in conclusion, in terms of accessibility, I'm going to be giving the point to Neuvillette, just because even though Mualani does have better synergy with her weapon options, it's not like Neuvillette is bad with Amber or Jade regardless, and in terms of gameplay, Neuvillette is just such a riskless character that I think it makes him more accessible overall, so first point goes to him. The next thing I want to talk about is their team options, aka their flexibility. Starting with Neuvillette, he has a lot of teams, but the most standout ones are his hypercarry setups, especially after Furina. In my opinion, I think his best general team is him with Zhongli, Kazuha, and Furina, but Zhongli can be subbed out for a lot of characters, don't get it wrong. Because Neuvillette has strong self-healing, if you're confident in your spacing, you'll be able to just run an off-field DPS like Fischl, which since I can't do the spin technique as I'm on console, makes mobbing content go really well due to EC swirls. You can also do a similar thing with Lisa and get a defense shred as well. There are also Vape, Neuvillette, and Furina setups using both Zhongli and Kazuha to enable Pyro for both of them to Vape, as they have quite slow Hydra application, but if you aren't that confident you can choose to run shielders like Kirara, Layla, and so on. Though if you want extra healing instead, then characters like Charlotte or Baizu could be more up your alley. Basically, there's a lot you can do from this team core alone. And even then, as we know, Neuvillette is designed around his ability to apply Hydro. That's a joke, he barely applies Hydro, so if you don't have Furina, then you can use him on Bloom or Hybrid Bloom teams, though these are just worse than his Furina teams. The last thing I want to mention are his Vape setups with Emily, which are his best carry teams that don't involve Furina. So yes, Neuvillette is very flexible and there are a lot of things you can consider with him. Now before talking about Mualani, this will have no bearing on her score, but she is somewhat lacking synergistic teammates right now, in the same way that Neuvillette did before Furina came out. Remember when people were running Tartaglia or Yolan with him? Mualani is a vaporized DPS and the Pyro Orcon is Pyro, so it's very likely that in the future Movwika will make Mualani's team building a lot better. But even as it stands now, a lot of Mualani teams in terms of damage are theoretically performing relative to Neuvillette from the calcs I've seen, so just keep that in mind. So what are Short Girl's current teams? Well, I'm glad you asked. She wants to be played on Vape setups, and since she attacks very slowly, it doesn't really matter who the Pyro Applicator is. Dea, Toma, Hel, Jinyan can all work as Pyro Applicators on her teams. And then from there you can slot in a Viridescent character and another support like Nahida for the EM buff, or Candice works too. Mualani is a character that can take advantage of very unorthodox teammates, but if you're looking at her best teams, I'd recommend just running Zhongli, Nahida, or Emily, and then Zhengling. This team is very easy to set up and gives you some of the best buff uptime compared to VV setups, but there's still more, assuming you don't get cucked at our Furina teams you can play too. The best being with Baizu and Zhengling to max out Fan Friend, still Vape through Burning and Zhengling's application. You do have to get extremely lucky with Furina's timings though, and even though she's designed to be run with Vape teams, she still has some pretty solid non-Vape teams too, like in Mono Hydro with Furina and Seedrine, where you're trading out Vape for a more consistent buffing routine, as well as Furina's personal damage buffed by the Melusine. Kachina is also a character that can replace Kazuha here, and hold on to the 4 scroll set for a 40% damage bonus and okay personal damage of her own. I think that's all about it, but all this to say that Mualani also has a ton of flexibility, like they're going bar for bar with teams, so I am just going to be leaving this as a tie. Both of them have so many good teams, and Mualani is able to make characters that aren't viewed that positively like Candice, Dea, Mona, and Seedrine shine, which I think is a W. And I don't think I need to restate Neuvillette's teammate diversity either, so they'll both get the point. Now we get into the scenario section of the video where we talk about how the characters perform in certain types of content. And since we're starting with single target, I want to point out something I noticed when calculating the damage for both of them in this video. And it's that they're very similar in damage, like absurdly close to the point that it seems intended. In some teams, Mualani has very high personal damage that exceeds Neuvillette's and vice versa. And for team DPS, both of them can slot in pretty good off-field DPS like Emily in Mualani's case and Furina for Neuvillette. So the way they deal their damage is going to be more important for these types of matchups. Mualani is close to the same as Linny in a sense that her damage is focused around nuking, so with the right setups I can just see her being a much faster boss killer than Neuvillette is, which I'm not too surprised by. Neuvillette isn't hailed as the best DPS due to his boss killing potential, seeing as his damage is more sustained than front-loaded, and there are a lot of carries better than him in that regard, like the big 3 Pyro DPS, Zhao Zhonyan teams, Al-Haytham Quick Bloom teams, etc. Mualani's burst alone is doing a quarter of most bosses' health bars, so assuming you reach the right damage thresholds with her, you should be able to one-rotate with her even at C0 quite easily, so I'm going to be giving the point to her over Neuvillette for boss scenarios. So there are 2 types of AoE content, one being mini-wave I guess, which would be 3 or less waves of enemies, and then there is multi-wave content like in this current abyss where it's 3 or more waves of enemies, that spawn somewhat far out of reach from each other. And we are going to be talking about mini-wave first. In AoE, Mualani gets a damage reduction of up to 28%, basically losing a quarter of her damage from her shark bites, which is quite a big hit to her. This is to compensate for the fact that she's able to mark multiple enemies and make them all take damage without a grouper essentially. But this isn't as bad as it seems, because in multiple target scenarios from beta testers I've talked to, she should be able to get 4 fully enhanced shark bites off where she's only able to get 3 in single target. And her burst doesn't get a damage reduction, so you're still doing a ton of damage from that. The 5.0 Abyss lineup has one of these mini-wave scenarios where it's 3 mushrooms and then a boss, in which Mualani's vaped burst alone is wiping out all the mushrooms completely, and then you get free reign on the boss with her skill. But to be fair, Neuvillette should also be able to do something very similar with one charge attack, so it's not like it's a massive upside for Mualani. Neuvillette also gets to regroup enemies in between his damage windows quite easily as he isn't tied to a stance change, like with Mualani, so if enemies spawn too spaced out for her, she won't feel as good. So it really does depend on the type of mini-wave. You know what, I'm copping out and I'm just going to give them both a point and say it's a tie. Neuvillette is obviously going to have an easier time with mini-wave just due to his ease of use, but if you're better with mapping out enemy placements and think a lot more, they should perform about the same, so tie. The last section of this video is going to be multi-wave content. I was not done speaking. In mobbing content, Neuvillette can just do this. And in 5-wave situations like the ones we have in the current Abyss lineup, Neuvillette's rotational flexibility just gives him so many upsides in this type of content, where Mualani being tied to his stance really restricts her, where there are multiple waves of enemies and she needs to stay close to enemies to build up her damage, and it becomes much more of an issue the more waves there are. To no one's surprise, Neuvillette is indeed getting this point. So in conclusion, currently I do think that Neuvillette is still the best Hydra DPS. Mualani will outdamage him on paper, especially with the new Abyss blessing that makes her do 40% more damage, but Neuvillette has never really just been about the damage aspect, and just the fact that there is so much quality of life built into every aspect of his kit, without requiring you to learn any hard cancels or techniques. But I do want to make some things clear. First, Neuvillette already has his premium team, and Trina will most likely be the biggest buff he will ever get for the near future, where with Mualani, due to things like her A4, she seems really incentivized to be run with Natlin units that we just don't have currently. Mualani is using characters like No Bennett Zhangling on full ER or Jin Yan, who just doesn't offer a lot, so a better off-field pyro unit and one that can take advantage of the 4 scroll set will make her so much better. But that is future impact, and I don't want you to base meta decisions off of what may happen. I'm just telling you that it's extremely likely that Mualani will get a lot better in the future. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this topic, as I'd love to hear it and respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.